People often think of love as something impossible to miss. The chemistry, the grand gestures, the emotional confessions, the moments that feel so intense they demand your attention. But some of the deepest forms of love are almost silent. They live inside quiet companionship, reliable presence, and that peaceful feeling you experience when being with someone simply feels like home. For an avoidant, this kind of quiet connection can communicate more than 1,000 words. Lasting commitment usually doesn't begin for them with dramatic romance or constant reassurance. It develops gradually through something much more meaningful: emotional safety. Someone who has spent years depending primarily on themselves may not feel closer because of emotional intensity. What truly helps them open is discovering that they can experience powerful emotions without losing their independence or becoming overwhelmed by what they feel. Many avoidants learn early that emotional closeness can bring discomfort. They may associate intimacy with criticism, pressure, losing control, or having their personal boundaries overlooked. So they create distance as a way to protect themselves. It isn't always because they don't want love. Sometimes they simply learned that keeping people at arm's length feels safer. Then they encounter someone who doesn't try to tear their walls down, someone who respects their space, understands their pace, and doesn't turn every moment of distance into an emotional battle. Slowly, something unfamiliar begins to grow. Peace within connection. And that peace can become the doorway to genuine commitment. The safer they feel in their independence, the easier it becomes for them to naturally bring you into their private world. You don't have to chase them, persuade them, or repeatedly prove why they should stay. What matters is building a relationship where their defenses don't have to remain fully activated all the time. And if you pay attention to what happens next, you'll notice that the smallest changes can carry the greatest meaning. With an avoidant, emotional security is usually built through consistency rather than intensity. They notice how you respond when disagreements happen. They remember whether you respect their need for space. They observe what you do when they become quiet. They're looking for patterns, even when they never say so directly. And when you remain emotionally steady instead of reacting with pressure, fear, or panic, something slowly starts changing inside them. They begin realizing that love doesn't automatically mean chaos. Closeness doesn't necessarily mean losing themselves. Emotional intimacy doesn't have to mean surrendering control. That realization can be deeply healing. Eventually, they may start offering pieces of themselves that they once kept carefully protected. They contact you more often. They tell you small details about their day. They invite you into their routine. They become more comfortable simply sharing space with you. A morning message, an invitation to spend time together, or an uncommon admission about something that scares them might seem unimportant from the outside. But for an avoidant, these can be significant acts of trust. What they're really communicating is, I feel safe enough to let you closer. And that can mean much more to them than an emotional declaration made in a dramatic moment. Their commitment may not resemble the kind of romance people usually expect. It may not include constant affection or endless verbal reassurance. Instead, it often shows up through dependability. When they genuinely commit, they're not simply deciding to love you. They're choosing to remain emotionally present even when their instinct tells them to disappear. They're accepting the risk of allowing someone to see the parts of themselves they've spent years protecting because they've decided the connection is worth the vulnerability. It takes time. It may feel uncomfortable. There may be moments when they question themselves. But once that decision becomes sincere, it can run remarkably deep. For an avoidant, forever may not sound like 1,000 beautiful promises. It may simply look like staying. When they allow you into their world, they're not merely sharing their time with you. They're challenging years of learned emotional self-protection. Their love may be understated, but understated doesn't mean shallow. They may express affection through consistency instead of intensity. understanding instead of control, and peace instead of emotional drama. In that sense, commitment becomes more than a promise. It becomes a transformation from fear into trust, from isolation into shared peace, and from constantly protecting themselves to finally believing they can remain. One of the clearest signs of that transformation is when they begin choosing your presence instead of automatically choosing distance. Avoidants are often associated with pulling away, but withdrawal isn't always evidence that they don't care. For some people, closeness activates a powerful fear of losing autonomy. Intimacy can feel like a threat to freedom, so retreating becomes their automatic method of regulating difficult emotions. But when that pattern begins to shift, something important is happening. They start moving toward connection instead of constantly escaping from it. This doesn't happen instantly. There may still be days when they want closeness and other days when they need space. They can feel caught between two strong needs: the desire to be loved and the fear that love will consume their independence. What helps resolve that conflict is experiencing a relationship where they don't have to choose between intimacy and freedom. When they discover that your closeness doesn't require them to surrender themselves, their mind and body can finally begin to relax. They learn that being with you doesn't mean giving up control. It can simply mean sharing life while continuing to remain themselves. At first, the changes can be almost impossible to notice. They stay a little longer. They talk for a little more time. They don't immediately rush away after spending time together. They become comfortable sitting beside you without constantly needing something to say. These tiny moments can reveal a major internal shift. Their nervous system is slowly learning that connection can feel calming rather than threatening. Where there was once tension, comfort begins to appear. Where there was once an automatic urge to escape, curiosity begins taking its place. Your presence gradually becomes associated with peace instead of pressure. And that is a powerful psychological change. When an avoidant begins genuinely wanting your presence, it can mean they no longer experience closeness as an emotional invasion. They aren't necessarily craving constant contact or needing to be together every moment. Instead, they're beginning to appreciate the stability and comfort of having you nearby. You become someone they can relax around instead of someone they instinctively feel they need to escape from. Their walls usually don't disappear because someone aggressively challenges them. They soften because repeated experiences of trust teach them that they don't need those walls raised every second. And this is where the smallest gestures can become surprisingly meaningful. You may notice them reaching for your hand, sharing a thought they would normally keep private, or becoming completely comfortable with silence beside you. These gestures can look ordinary to someone else, but for a person who once relied heavily on emotional distance, they can represent enormous progress. They're learning that safety doesn't have to exist only in solitude. It can also exist in another person's presence. And seeking closeness doesn't mean they suddenly stop needing independence. Healthy intimacy allows both things to exist together. They can have personal space without turning that space into emotional separation. They can be close without feeling controlled. They can open up without feeling completely exposed. They're no longer looking for freedom only by running away from connection. They're beginning to discover freedom inside a safe connection. That is what makes this stage so meaningful. Their love becomes less about performance and more about peaceful companionship. They choose to be near you because they genuinely want to, not because they're being pressured, chased, or obligated. Their quiet loyalty, their comfort around you, and their willingness to simply share ordinary moments can become some of the strongest signs that their feelings are becoming more mature. When an avoidant starts seeking your presence, you may have become connected to their sense of inner peace. You become someone around whom they don't feel the constant need to run. And when they finally begin showing you the emotional chaos they normally keep hidden, that can represent an even deeper level of trust. Because allowing you to see what exists behind their calm exterior means they're no longer simply letting you into their daily life. They're allowing you to see parts of their inner world that they normally keep protected. That kind of vulnerability can feel completely different for someone who has spent years depending on emotional distance. They may begin telling you about fears they usually keep private. They may admit when something hurt them instead of pretending they are unaffected. They may explain what is happening inside them instead of simply disappearing. They might even reveal uncertainty and remain present afterward rather than immediately retreating. And that last part matters more than it may seem. Vulnerability isn't only about opening up, it's also about staying after you've opened up. For someone who has learned to protect themselves through distance, remaining present after revealing something personal can feel deeply uncomfortable. But if they choose to stay anyway, they're learning something new about intimacy. They're discovering that being seen doesn't automatically mean being judged. Being close doesn't automatically mean losing themselves. Allowing someone to matter doesn't automatically mean surrendering their independence. This is how trust becomes stronger. Not through one dramatic conversation, but through repeated experiences that slowly teach them a new meaning of closeness. Each safe interaction becomes another piece of evidence that connection doesn't have to be dangerous. Each moment of acceptance makes it easier to lower the walls a little more. And eventually, what once felt threatening can begin feeling familiar. You may also notice changes in how they communicate. They may become less defensive when conversations become emotional. They might not immediately shut down when something serious is brought up. Instead of changing the subject, they may stay with the conversation longer. Instead of disappearing after conflict, they may return and attempt to explain themselves. Instead of treating every emotional need as pressure, they may begin understanding that your needs aren't automatically demands for control. These changes can happen slowly, and they may not always be perfectly consistent. Growth doesn't move in a straight line. There can still be moments of hesitation, withdrawal, uncertainty, or fear. But the important difference is that they begin returning with greater awareness. They start recognizing their own patterns. They become more willing to repair instead of simply escaping. And that willingness can matter more than perfect behavior. Emotional safety isn't created because two people never struggle. It's created when both people learn that struggle doesn't automatically mean the relationship is unsafe. An avoidant who is becoming more secure may still need space, but that space begins to look different. It isn't used to punish you or create confusion. It becomes a healthier way of regulating themselves while staying connected. They can tell you they need time without making you feel abandoned. They can step back without completely disappearing. And eventually, they can come back without expecting you to pretend that nothing happened. That is a completely different form of emotional maturity. The deeper transformation happens when their instinct changes from protecting themselves from you to protecting the connection with you. In the past, discomfort may have triggered the thought, I need to get away. Now, they may begin thinking, I need some space, but I don't want to lose this person. That difference is enormous. It shows that the connection has become valuable enough for them to work through discomfort rather than automatically running from it. They begin realizing that intimacy doesn't have to erase independence. They can have their own interests, friendships, routines, and private time while still building something meaningful with another person. Love stops feeling like a cage and starts feeling like a place where both people can breathe. And when that happens, commitment doesn't need to be forced. It starts appearing naturally through choices. They make room for you. They consider your feelings. They include you in decisions. They remember the things that matter to you. They show up when avoiding the situation would be easier. They begin understanding that consistency isn't a loss of freedom, it's an expression of care. And perhaps most importantly, they stop treating emotional closeness as something they have to survive. They begin experiencing it as something they can actually enjoy. That's when their presence becomes more intentional. They aren't simply staying because they're afraid of losing you. They're staying because they've discovered that being connected to you can exist alongside being fully themselves. And that is one of the deepest forms of emotional growth. So if you're trying to understand whether an avoidant is genuinely becoming more committed, don't focus only on what they say. Watch what they repeatedly do. Look for consistency. Look for emotional responsibility. Look for a willingness to communicate after difficult moments. Look for the small ways they include you in their life without feeling forced. Notice whether their need for space can exist alongside their ability to remain emotionally connected. Because lasting love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a person who once ran from closeness choosing to stay a little longer. Sometimes it's the message they send after an argument because they don't want the distance to become permanent. Sometimes it's a quiet hand reaching for yours without needing an explanation. Sometimes it's sitting beside you in complete silence and feeling no urge to escape. These moments may never look dramatic enough for a movie, but they can carry enormous emotional meaning. When someone has spent years believing independence requires emotional distance, discovering that they can remain independent while loving deeply can change everything. They begin understanding that connection doesn't have to take away their identity. Love doesn't have to become control. Vulnerability doesn't have to become weakness. Commitment doesn't have to mean surrendering themselves. It can mean choosing another person while continuing to choose themselves. That is the kind of commitment that grows quietly, steadily, and deeply. And when someone reaches that place, their love may still be understated, but you'll feel the difference in the way they stay, the way they return, the way they communicate, the way they trust, and the way they finally allow you to see the person behind the walls. They're allowing you to see deeper parts of who they really are. For much of their lives, avoidants may have learned to treat emotions as something unsafe. Vulnerability can feel like an open door to getting hurt, while depending only on themselves can feel like the safest way to survive. So they build an inner world that looks controlled from the outside, even when everything inside feels uncertain. Behind that calm surface can live fears they rarely talk about, insecurities they almost never admit, and a deep feeling of emotional loneliness. Allowing another person into that private space requires an enormous amount of trust. So when an avoidant begins showing you what is actually happening inside them, it isn't a small or casual gesture. It can be one of the deepest forms of emotional commitment they know how to express. In their quiet way, they're telling you that they no longer see you as someone they have to constantly defend themselves against. They see you as someone who can witness the real version of them without turning their weaknesses into weapons. And that is a major shift. Avoidants often live behind emotional barriers designed to protect them from uncertainty and emotional unpredictability. They've learned to keep their feelings contained and maintain a composed appearance even when they're struggling internally. Their need for distance isn't always a rejection of love. Sometimes it's simply the protection strategy they learned long ago. So when they finally stop hiding everything behind that calm exterior, something important has changed within them. Their instinct to pull away begins becoming softer because they've discovered that your presence doesn't create more chaos inside them. Instead, being around you can actually bring a sense of calm. And if you've been wondering what real emotional progress looks like, this is one of the signs worth watching closely. It often starts with small revelations. Maybe they tell you about something difficult from their childhood. Maybe they admit a fear they've never spoken about. Maybe they share a personal experience they usually keep completely private. To another person, this might sound like a normal conversation, but for an avoidant, every piece of personal truth can represent another part of the emotional wall beginning to come down. As they experience acceptance instead of judgment, they're slowly learning something they may have struggled to believe for years. They don't have to be perfect to deserve love. Being vulnerable doesn't automatically end in rejection. Being seen doesn't necessarily mean being controlled. And allowing someone to become close doesn't always lead to pain. Their vulnerability may not appear in a smooth or confident way. They might hesitate, They may struggle to find the right words. They might suddenly change the subject, laugh awkwardly, or even apologize for becoming emotional. They may not know how to explain exactly what they're feeling, but beneath that awkwardness is something incredibly meaningful, the desire to be understood. At this point, they're no longer trying so hard to appear impossible to hurt. They want understanding more than admiration. They don't need you to believe they're perfect. They need to know that you can see their flaws, their fears, and their emotional confusion while still remaining a safe person for them. Opening up can also become an unspoken test of trust. Someone who has spent years fearing rejection may quietly wonder what will happen once you see the parts of them they consider difficult, weak, or damaged. Your response becomes important. When you meet their honesty with patience rather than criticism, they begin forming a new understanding of what love can actually feel like. They start realizing that love doesn't require them to hide every weakness. They begin discovering that emotional honesty doesn't automatically make them powerless. And eventually, their vulnerability may move beyond old fears and painful memories. They may start telling you what they genuinely need. They might ask for comfort. They may ask for reassurance. They could tell you they need understanding or even ask for some space instead of simply disappearing. That is a major turning point for someone who learned to survive by keeping everything locked inside. Revealing their emotional world can become one of their strongest expressions of trust. It's almost as if they're saying, "I'm letting you see the parts of me that I normally keep hidden." And that is where guarded affection can begin turning into real intimacy. Their love doesn't need to be demonstrated through dramatic gestures. Sometimes their strongest expression of love is simply telling you the truth. Showing you their internal struggle isn't necessarily a sign of weakness. In many cases, it is evidence that they've become strong enough to stop hiding. They're not always asking you to solve what they're going through. They may simply want you to understand what they're carrying. And when you respond by staying present, instead of trying to control, pressure, or immediately fix everything, the relationship can begin feeling less like a battlefield and more like a place where both people can breathe. That's an important distinction. Real intimacy isn't always about solving someone's pain. Sometimes it's about making them feel safe enough to share it. And when an avoidant experiences that kind of safety repeatedly, the meaning of closeness can slowly begin to change. Another powerful sign of deepening feelings appears when an avoidant starts protecting the relationship instead of only protecting themselves. For a long time, their strongest instinct may have been self-preservation, protecting their independence, avoiding emotional dependence, maintaining control, creating distance before they could become too exposed. Love can feel attractive to them while also feeling dangerous. It offers warmth and connection, but it also creates the possibility of loss, betrayal, disappointment, rejection, or feeling trapped. So when they begin protecting the relationship itself, it shows that something significant has shifted inside them. The connection is no longer simply something they fear might hurt them. It has become something valuable enough to protect. Early in a relationship, an avoidant may disappear when conflict appears. Silence can seem easier than explaining themselves. Distance can feel safer than sitting inside uncomfortable emotions. But as their feelings deepen, they may begin staying even when things become difficult. They may still need time to process. They may still struggle to communicate perfectly. But instead of abandoning the connection completely, they begin searching for ways to repair it. That movement from escaping toward repairing is enormous. It means the relationship has started becoming more important than their automatic urge to withdraw. And this is where you can often see the difference between someone who simply misses you and someone who is actually learning how to build something with you. They also begin noticing your emotional experience instead of focusing only on protecting their own boundaries. They may pause before reacting. They become more aware of how their actions affect you. They begin understanding that protecting their own peace shouldn't require destroying yours. Love slowly starts moving from pure self-preservation toward mutual care. This doesn't happen because they suddenly become a completely different person. It happens through repeated experiences. They notice your patience. They see that you can respect their independence without trying to control them. They experience a form of love that doesn't demand they abandon themselves, and gradually they begin returning that same sense of safety in their own way. You may notice them handling emotional triggers differently. When they're overwhelmed, they may still need space, but instead of disappearing without explanation, they tell you they need some time. When an argument happens, they may still become uncomfortable, but they begin making an effort to work through the issue instead of simply walking away. Their actions start communicating something they may struggle to say directly. I don't want to lose what we have. And that is emotional growth. They're discovering that staying connected doesn't automatically mean giving up their freedom. In fact, a healthy relationship can give their independence a deeper meaning because now they're choosing connection rather than feeling forced into it. Protecting the bond becomes their quiet way of showing commitment. They may not casually promise forever, but their behavior begins moving in that direction. They show up when it matters. They consider how major decisions affect both people. They make space for the relationship in their future. When misunderstandings happen, they care enough to protect what exists between you.